At the kitchen table today, we have Sheila Dillon from the Radio 4 food programme. So thank you, Sheila, for coming
Delighted to be here, Kate.
at the kitchen table.
Down south, not up north, right? Yep.
So when we first met, you interviewed me for the food programme, and you came. You were going back to your roots, and you came first of all to. You met me on Preston train station.
That's right.
Where I was talking about one of my food heroes, Beatrice Blackhurst, who set up the Soldiers and Sailors Buffet during World War One and managed to feed millions of servicemen going off to war. And then we went along to Horton Tower to the farmers market, which I believe one of your, is it an uncle that had worked there?
No, I mean, I grew up in Horton.
You grew up, yes.
And my granddad was the joiner, the head joiner on the estate. So, yeah. But it's a merchant's market, isn't it? In Horton, it's a mix of producers and farmers, and I don't know why I'm correcting you, Kay. That's absurd. But anyway, yes, we went there, and it was freezing and raining. And I got the producer, Rich Ward, sent me a photograph a few months ago. Us both smiling, but looking bloody cold.
I had a big yellow coat on.
Oh,
yeah, it was really cold.
Anyway, yeah.
And then we got a tour of Horton Tower, which
right.
So it was great. When did your food story begin? Like you kind of grew up there. I'm sure with that there was a farm. There was farmland there. When did your food story
begin? I don't know what
begin?
you mean food story, really, because I just grew up in a village in the 50s and 60s. Well, 50s really, where good food was just the norm. I mean, I didn't think about it really. I didn't think about what I now know, which is that both my mom, who worked full time with 3 kids, and my grandma, who was a housewife, how they both cooked really well, and simple things but really good things. And my grandma would shop at Preston Market twice a week and get the bus because there was a good transport system. And what we now are sort of self-conscious about, in terms of quality, was the way things were. We didn't eat junk, and cooking was simple. And so I ate good food, and I went to university and met middle-class people and realized that the things I'd grown up with were not the norm for a lot of people. And that some food was really poor. So, but I didn't even, sort of like, oh God. And then I went to the United States. I went to, actually an important thing for me was my first job was in Finland with the British Council. And Finns, at that time, they ate in the same way that we had done in Horton, but people did not celebrate that they just took it for granted in Lancashire. In Finland, people were enormously proud. They would show you, the local cheese, the local ham, and I was really amazed by that, and it was just lovely. And they, went mushrooming and berry picking and the things that my mum did, and my whole family did, and I didn't, people didn't talk about that. But in Finland, it was like one of the joys of life that you would do that.
Wow.
And it was like, going to a nightclub or something. It was something you talked about. So Finland was a real eye-opener. And then I went to graduate school, which I quickly dropped out of. But anyway, I went to the US, to Indiana, and, to a food system that was like bonkers. But, I went to a supermarket and, they had cream in aerosols and all this funny stuff frozen in cardboard tubes. And I was thinking, wow! And then it didn't take me long to figure out that it was pretty bad stuff. But I kind of thought it was like a bad joke. I didn't have to take it seriously. I didn't think about it. I didn't eat like that. I still ate, apart from I bought a couple of aerosols of cream and stuff like that. But I thought it was just a bad joke. I didn't take it seriously, the awfulness of the American food system, until a while later. I was married, living in New York, in Manhattan, and I was one day. My baby was about, I don't know how old he was, 10 months, 11 months. He was on solid foods, and I was sitting there reading the New York Times as I did every morning, and I saw this story about pesticide poisoning on Long Island, where they were growing potatoes in the middle of the island, and there was a pesticide. It poisoned the water supply, and I thought, how can that happen? And I thought, well, they closed the wells in this area, and because they were of the danger of this pesticide, and so I went because I had been mashing my son's food into potatoes, and I thought, what the hell? I wonder how much is in the potatoes if it's in the water supply. And then I went and I read about pesticide residue limits in the library, and I saw how corrupt the science was, or corrupt, how it was a system geared um, towards the pesticide company, toward the companies that made pesticides. And I just thought, who's writing about this? Who's broadcasting about this? Where is this happening? And the answer was hardly anyone was doing it. And so I decided, it's a long story, but I decided to volunteer at this magazine called Food Monitor. It was a radical food magazine, and it's one of the few things I could find. And they took me on because I was a journalist, and in the sense that you're asking the question, that's when the food story began, but it had its roots in the girl that I was, eating all that good food, and what I didn't
Because
say.
you knew what good food was.
I knew what good food was, and I didn't think it should be poisoned. And I had also worked at my local farm from when I was 13 to when I went to university at weekends and summer holidays. So although I didn't grow up on a farm, I worked on a farm.
So you had that experience with good food, and now with your work, that you've continued to tell food stories over the years. What is it about that work that you do that really drives you and gets you out of bed in the morning?
Well, I think, like most people, I want to understand why the world is the way it is. And I wanted to do that before. And what I realized about food was it's you can see power. You can see why we eat why power structures are the way they are through food, by asking yourself, why we eat, why do 65 or 70% of teenagers now eat ultra processed foods with disastrous effects on their mental and physical health? Why do we have a food system that seems to create sickness? And my husband is a financial journalist, and when I said I was going to write about food, he just was, he was very American, and he thought, food, oh, for God's sake. And so anyway, we had a lot of rows, and eventually he said, well, if you're going to do it, follow the money. And so that's what I've always tried to do. Who's profiting from this? Who's making money? How? Why? And that's what I get up to try, and I want to understand the connection between the food on our plate, the pleasure we take in the countryside, the sense of renewal we have when we walk in fields and woods, and what the food system actually is.
And so,
and injustice too.
Yeah. So I was just going to say that you kind of been a driving force, really, I feel, in raising awareness about food issues in the programs that you make, and to me it kind of feels like you're educating people in a way that they can really understand and embrace. But I think in that you're also creating a demand for better food, and feel like we need more of that.
I don't know. Do we? I don't know. I mean, that's what I hope. But the food system has got worse since I started being a food journalist. So, what good have I done? I could have gone into floristry, really, couldn't I?
Well, I'm glad that you do what you do, because I feel like a lot of people are able to understand systems which they might you make it easy to understand. You make the complicated system that we have understandable to people who are not experts in that area. So to me, I think it's very important.
It's a very easy thing to see that where there's money to be made. I mean, we heard today at Groundswell, we heard the former CEO of the Sainsbury's food chain, supermarkets, talking about consumer choice and how that was the driver. And you think, goodness, you know, we have created these consumers. We don't talk about them as citizens or people, or we've created these people, two or three generations now who've not been taught to cook, don't know how to cook, don't know how to shop, don't understand what it is they're buying. I mean, I'm not condescending to them. It's just a fact that we don't think food's important,
Mm.
and that you think, well, and he was giving the reasons why they don't pay farmers more for their produce, and I think that's it's an economic system which is geared to help them, and lots of supermarkets, a goodly percentage, not just Sainsbury's, but a goodly percentage of supermarket employees are on benefits. If they're on benefits, what we buy there is helping the share price
Yeah.
of Tesco.
Yeah.
All those, they're all helped by the taxpayer. So I want to say to people, do you understand what this food system is doing to you and how they are taking advantage of the food system? And what I was going to say before, I've now regained the thread, is that when I came back to live in Britain, I listened to the food program on the radio and I heard Derek Cooper, and I thought, oh, I need to work there. That's where I need to work. And so I got a job finally. It took a long time, as a reporter. But once you're a reporter, people go, do you want to produce? And I thought, yeah, I do want to produce food programs. I want to produce. And the first program I ever did as a producer was a long interview with Lady Eve Balfour, the founder of the Sword Association. And it was a couple of years, probably less, a year before she died. And I'd come across her name when I was at the magazine as founder of this organic food movement in Britain. And what a remarkable woman, aristocrat. But, so what? She made an enormous difference by doing the simple thing, which is, looking at what happens to plants when you plant them in healthy soil. Healthy soil, healthy animals, healthy plants, healthy people, healthy, it's sometimes I think the food system is actually, it's made so complicated, and it's not complicated. It's really quite simple. We're meant to eat whole foods.
Yeah. But it's now become so complicated to make that happen.
Yeah.
I think that's the problem with the food movement today. What do you think that we need more of to try and make that happen? It feels almost like we need to scrap the system and start again, because actually changing it is too difficult. But what do you think could be done?
I think you have to really go back to basics.
Yeah.
It's really difficult with politicians and policymakers. I think you have to teach children to cook right from age 5. The minute they go into primary school, you just have to start. They have to have good food for their meals, and they have to learn to cook, because it's a life skill, and that's the simplicity of it. But you get politicians who don't think, cooking is female,
Yeah.
what difference does that make? but it's profound difference. You've got. I don't see any other way. You can't. You can't do. You can. Well, you can make some top-down changes. Of course, you can. You could have taxes on junk food. You could. There's all kinds of things. But I think you also have to go in at the bottom.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is actually a lot of the work that I do. And I see how it works, and I see how it does. I work with parents and children together, and it does make a difference. And I was teaching nutrition to some health professionals this week, actually, and they were saying to me, why do we not learn this at school? Why? And these are health professionals. Why don't we know about food? Why don't we know about nutrition from at school? And I don't know why, but it seems
Well, think
ridiculous.
of the big changes that happened when the Thatcher government came in. Think of the end of school meal provision. You didn't have to do that anymore, and there were no standards. And think of the teaching, home economics or domestic science or whatever. Think of that being changed to food technology. I mean, that's as though, what does it matter? What does it matter?
No, why did they change the name?
I mean, we just made what I think is a very interesting program with Professor Michael Crawford, who the scientist who, he's in his mid-90s now, but he has done all this research on the brain and how we need omega-3 fatty. We need to eat from the marine web and meat from animals that have grazed on proper, not ryegrass, but mixed pastures and so on. And I was fascinated to discover that at the beginning of the Second World War, he lived in Edinburgh, and he was sent as an evacuee north to a public school, to a posh public school. And there, a boys' school, there they were taught to fish and to cook.
Ah,
isn't that amazing?
Yes.
And I'm convinced after that one of the reasons that when he got his PhD and he went to Uganda, when the scientific world was really excited about genetics, that was going to be the answer to everything. He went to Uganda, set up this laboratory, started observing patterns of disease, and he thought, it's what people eat that keeps them healthy or creates disease. That's really simple, isn't it?
Yeah, very simple. Yeah. And I'm sure an enriching experience for any boy to do that. And
can you imagine a public school now for boys doing that? You think they do that at Eton? I mean, Henry Dimbleby turned out really well, but then his mother was, the amazing, amazing cook and Jossie Dimbleby. But I don't think Eton does that.
Well, that would be amazing to bring that back. What? So before we finish, Yes. Yeah, I would love to see that. What gives you hope in these, I would call, turbulent times? I don't know what you would call it.
What gives me hope? I just was at something called Carbon Calling, which got its inspiration from Groundswell, where we're recording this, and it's a much smaller affair, but there were farmers from all over the northwest and the northeast exchanging information, and there were especially some very powerful women who were just breaking, just doing things. And there was one farmer, a woman who looked like everybody's, cliche of a grandma. She had permed grey hair, and she looked like everybody's grandma. Anyway, she turned out to be an absolute whiz with figures and spreadsheets and all this stuff. And she and her husband had bought a hill farm in 1993. And she had pushed for this. She saw, the more inputs they were putting in, the less money they were making. The animals were not that healthy. They had bullocks, the bullocks, and they had sheep. And it was fascinating the way she just figured out, that she met some regen farmers, young ones, and thought how she might change, and how her husband resisted. She talked about this, how he resisted, no change. Even if you're not making money, you have to stick with the conventions. Women are that gives me hope. The women farmers in particular that I met in Carbon Calling just see them changing.
You mentioned somebody from New Zealand. Was that the lady from New
Yes.
Zealand? Who's here?
It was here.
I need to yeah,
Yes.
find her.
Jess, oh God, I can't remember her name.
You've sent it to me. Yeah, yeah.
No, she was, I mean, I think we all felt, oh my God, this is possible. Change is possible. And then look at Groundswell.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember coming really early on, and it was tiny. Were you here during that time?
Coming for the last 4 years.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's grown massively.
Yeah, it's just suddenly. I mean, you think, ooh, a bit of greenwash here and there, and people just figuring out how they can make money out of this change. But it's a really good change.
Yeah, it feels like it. And just finally,
are you feeling optimistic?
It's a really difficult time. There's a couple of things going on. So we've now, the meeting that you came to in February, we had Michael Green, who was a cabinet member. He was a Conservative. However, he was just really supportive, and he got the council on board with the work that I'm doing with farmers. And then we had the local elections, and Reform got in. And they're just not really interested in this area of nature-friendly farming, and I don't know how to approach them and how to almost reframe it. It kind of feels like I've taken a bit of a step back. Not sure if you've got any advice on how I can now tackle this political issue, which I feel completely out of my depth.
I think somebody said today. I think it was in the meeting that Henry Dimble was chairing with Justin King, formerly of Sainsbury's, and George Eustace, formerly of DEFRA, that there's a lot of anger. People feel lack of control. That so many things are happening around them. People getting sick. There's a lot of stuff feeding into creation of anger, which feeds into far right. People's unformulated rage, and why is it so bad? Why are things apparently going to hell in a handcart? I mean, maybe they really are going to hell in a handcart, but I don't think probably Reform has the answer.